We don't see you yet.
You don't see me?
Now we
see me?
do. We do.
Okay, cool. Okay, I'm super sorry for my technical difficulties delaying the start time, but welcome everyone to the University of Wyoming Black Studies Center Black History Month webinar series revolving around the death of Black Wall Street and the myth of the American dream from 1921 to 2021. Tonight is the first segment of our Cinematic Realism and Racist Propaganda film series, in which we'll explore the cultural impact of the film The Birth of a Nation and how it continues to play into the racism and bigotry that our society is plagued with still today. So I am Kimberly Vogel. I am the Director of Community Engagement and a Research Assistant at the University of Wyoming's Black Studies Center. And before we jump into tonight's topic, I just want to go over some generic goals of the center, as well as some tips on how tonight will go work. So the 4 goals of the Black Studies Center at the University of Wyoming comprise of creating an institutional platform that will dedicate efforts and resources to support culturally responsive teaching, rural community-focused engagement, and evidence-based research related to Black studies, as well as inspire and provide students with opportunities to understand and appreciate the importance of interrelations of the complex concepts and theories that constitute Black studies. Third, our goal is to assist students in securing the necessary skills to think critically about and convey and articulate the conditions of the Black experience by developing a sense of cultural insight to identity and understand patterns of historical development. And lastly, to introduce students to the fundamental rigors of graduate research to comprehend the importance of historical interpretation's theoretical underpinnings. So in just a moment, I'll introduce tonight's moderator, who will introduce our speakers, but just a couple technical notes. This is a conversation where we are here to listen to panel guests, but we encourage everyone to join in the conversation. So please feel free to put any questions or comments in the chat box. And if it is questions and we have time at the end of the panel, we will go straight into a Q&A and sort of open up the dialogue to all of our viewers. So a second note, just looking ahead for this week of the rest of our Black History Month series, this Friday at 5:30 p.m., the Black Studies Center is hosting the 3rd annual Black History Month conference, hosting a keynote speaker, Dr. Ashley Howard from the University of Iowa. So be sure to block off your schedules this Friday at 5:30 to tune in to everything that Dr. Howard has to say, as well as the rest of the Black History Month conference, which I believe starts at 9 a.m. at the whole day, and then Dr. Howard's event is at 5:30. So sorry for that confusion, but it does start at 9 a.m. So before I introduce tonight's moderator as well, just to sort of tie in a contemporary perspective on what we're talking about tonight. As I'm sure most of you are aware, The Birth of a Nation was, I believe, the first moving picture film, still a silent film, that was produced and sort of went viral across the nation in the terms of going, and being the first film shown at the White House in 1915. And so Birth of a Nation is basically an egregious caricature of the Reconstruction period, and places Black people, specifically Black men, in a light of being ferocious, aggressive threats to white society, in particular white women, and shines a light on the KKK, the Ku Klux Klan, as this Southern savior group that was born in response to just Black people basically pillaging white communities after slavery. And if anyone has had a comprehensive history lesson, it's an extremely inaccurate depiction of, one, how Reconstruction era operated in terms of racial relations, and two, more broadly, just an inaccurate representation of Black people and how Black people act and treat white people, and the relationship between Black and white people during the time of Reconstruction, especially in consideration of the Ku Klux Klan being this sort of saviorist group. And so I was really excited to hear that we were going over this film, and we've had this in the works for a few months now. And then, trying to consider the impact of the media, or in today's terms that sometimes comes off as like the news programs, but something as like Hollywood and the Grammys and the Emmys, just being media, something that people consume in an entertainment source. I had to go back to this idea when looking at what happened at the Capitol on January 6th, right? And so in today's times, looking at how the media's representations of how the distinction between Black Lives Matter protests from the summer of 2020 versus a storming of the Capitol by alt-right conservative conspiracy theorists that are storming the nation's capital. And as I'm sure most of you are aware, the police response, being very distinct and different in terms of use of force and showing of force, just simply being there. And so I don't want to talk too much. Obviously, like, we have a panel of experts that have a lot to say on this, but as we're going through this panel and this discussion, I do want to open up to the audience the ideas of how the media today, even in something of news coverage, can change and skew and obscure people's perspectives on how race relations, or specifically how people in this country are treated differently, right? In terms of this summer and January, in terms of sort of black and white, or people of color versus white conspiracy theorists, and really the difference between those two groups being a group wanting and begging for power and equality and justice versus a group that has power, exerting that to the full extent and facing very little in terms of repercussions. And so I know that can sort of seem like a stretch when thinking about Birth of a Nation and Hollywood and media, but we have to consider, while going through this conversation, how does something like The Birth of a Nation and its notoriety and the messages and images that it blasted out into the world during the time of Reconstruction, and how that plays into not only how groups like people on January 6th come to be and how those groups get so much power and weight, but then how we have groups like the people protesting the summer of 2020, during the summer of 2020, and how they are treated differently by political leaders in power in terms of language used to describe them, incarceral force in terms of how many people were arrested or incarcerated or ticketed or any of those things. And then lastly, how the media frames both of those events and plays to their sides and promotes whatever image you all believe has been promoted by the media coverage. So no, that'll be enough for me tonight. Just something to sort of bring it into a contemporary comparison, and I'm sure our moderators and Dr. Dixon will do a lot better job than I will. So without further notice, I will introduce tonight's moderator, which is Dr. Frederick Douglass Dixon. He is the director of UW's Black Studies Center. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Dixon.
Thank you. Thank you, Timberly. And thank you for all the work that you do in the community, particularly with the Black Studies Center. And I want you guys to know that what happened this summer in Laramie, Wyoming, was largely in part because of Timberly's direction and the way that she moved to strike and protest against funding the police and the police department here in Laramie, and some distinct things that came of that. One of the things was that Chief O'Malley is no longer around. So those are tangible. And when we think about that, that's incredible for us to understand how that works. So thanks to Timberly, and she's a great help with the Black Studies Center. So welcome everybody to the 2021 first event for Black Studies and the Black Studies Center Black History Month Conference. So today, our topic is cinematic realism and racist propaganda. When we think about those terms, cinematic realism, I think about the ism, the thought of cultural appropriation through movies. And that's what we're talking about, the idea of cinematic realism, how the cinema becomes real in specific ways. Well, one of the things that I would like to share with you all is that, what is your favorite movie? Begin to think about that. How did it influence you? Cinematic realism has a power. And in that power, you find that something that's not real becomes real. So one of the things I think about as a young man growing up in Chicago was I saw the very first Rocky movie. I don't know how many of you guys have seen that Rocky movie, but the power of the cinema was so astute in my thought while I was watching a movie that me as a young Black man who had been discriminated against and put in many situations that were unfair, time and time again, consistently, the power of cinematic realism, for the most part, had me rooting for Rocky over Apollo Creed. So I was hoping that the white man would beat the Black man and beat him badly. That's the power of cinematic realism. Let's think about what happens in the early Black and white movies when we think about cowboys and Indians. What did that do? So to talk about cinematic realism and to understand how powerful it is, then I have three individuals who will bring a host of attitudes and opinions and assertions to the table about Birth of a Nation. You've heard a lot about it. I'm going to go over some small things, but first I want to go through the guest list. First guest, Dr. Simone Drake out of Ohio State University. She's the chair of the Department of African American Studies, and she's the Hazel C. Youngberg Trustees Distinguished Professor. She's an amazing author, and we'll go over a couple of her books. When We Imagine Grace, Black Men and Subject Making in 2016. African American Women and the Construction of Critical Appropriations, Transnational Identity, Black Power Culture in the 21st Century. And one thing that I've grown to know about Dr. Drake is she is a consummate scholar. If there's something that I need for her to go over, I don't have to say it, just send it to her, and she sends it back much differently. So she has this amazing way of scholarship. So we're glad to have her. Along with Dr. Drake, we have a legend from Chicago, Mr. Pomone Ramey, who is Chicago personified, so many ways. And you know, a lot of times when the hosts introduce their guests, they go aggrandizement, grandiose, but I'm telling you the absolute truth. When it comes to Pomone, he is this legend in Chicago and in Black cinema and cinema generally. And I think about how we are connected a couple ways. One way that we are connected, we're both born and raised in Chicago. So when I think about when it comes to him, there are a couple things that you need to know. Now, some of these movies you may not readily recognize, but I ask you to write them down. I ask for you to understand the importance of you learning cinema when there was a time where Blacks were not represented the way they are now in more than one way. But one of the things that talks about is when Pomone was a very young man, he was part of the Black student movement, the Black Power movement, the Black arts movement in Chicago. And he was a leader when close to 35,000 Black students walked out of Chicago public schools. Think about what I said. 35,000 Black students walked outside of their classrooms and hit the streets. This was very organized. And I got a chance to see the picture, one of the posters in his office. It was amazing. Now, it's amazing to me because I'm writing on the Black studies. I'm writing on Black student activism and protests in Chicago. So he fits within that thought as a giant. One of the things that connects us as well, he's the former director of education at DuSable Museum. I have a long history at DuSable Museum through my dad. So DuSable Museum is the oldest and at one time the largest Black museum in the country. So a couple things that he's been a part of, the Blues Brothers, if you've ever heard of that, that's a giant in motion picture. Mahogany, Cooley High, these are some of my favorite movies. So when I think about having Pomone here, when I asked him to come, he said that he would do it. But the idea of having him here as an iconic figure is very, very important. So we welcome him as well. And then we go to my colleague, Caskey Russell. They call him Christopher Caskey Russell. He's out of the University of Wyoming School of Gender, Culture, Social Justice. More specifically, he directs the Native American program now. He's a great colleague. He's an author. But what he is concerned about humanity. So he's befriended me since I've been here. But the idea of scholarship, he's proven to the masses of scholars here of the importance of the indigenous, to bring that to the table. So when I think about my three guests, this will be a very enlightening conversation. So before we get right into it, Birth of a Nation, 1915. Now, as a historian, a couple ways I can explain this to you. Look at it this way: the social atmosphere of America. The social atmosphere of America at this time, de jure, of the court, is separate but equal, 1897, when we think about Plessy versus Ferguson. So that is the law on the book, separate but equal. So that gives you a way to look at the social atmosphere. And think about the major event, World War I, the fight against fascism. Social movement, a couple ways to look at it, more than one. An overarching social movement and an embedded social movement. The overarching social movement is the American lynching movement, and what Dr. Sundiata Chachua from the University of Illinois calls the nadir, the worst part of the American lynching movement. Well, when you think about social movements, they normally don't last long. But if you think about the American lynching movement, it has been one of the longest social movements. In fact, last summer, there were 2 young Black men lynched in California. So as contemporary as 2020, the American lynching movement is a part of it, which led to, as we think about 1915, the Red Summer. So this is white massive resistance as a response to so-called perceived and real advancement of Blacks in society. And then we think about what we're talking about this entire month, the death of Black Wall Street, 1921. In many ways we look at it. Well, one way we look at it is financial and the idea of intergenerational continuity when it thinks about an economic piece. But we think about the land that was stolen. We think about the people that were killed. And then there's one piece that I'd like to bring up, 1917, the Houston Mutiny. And when you think about these times, history may point to you that Black folks didn't fight back. Well, the Houston Mutiny is the one anomaly of many anomalies that we don't know about, where we saw World War I soldiers, more specifically Buffalo soldiers, become part of the fray. And we saw a mutiny in Houston in the summer of 1917. So all of these things create what we know now as the social atmosphere of this particular movie. Well, welcome guests, and thank you all so much. I think we're ready to get started. So as we have been taught, ladies first, Dr. Drake, as we begin this, when you think about how Birth of a Nation is set in Reconstruction, and there is what seems to be a phobia of what's going to happen with the country during Reconstruction, and you think about how it depicts the danger of what will happen with the emancipation of Blacks. Could you give us your thoughts on that?
Sure. I think that the film actually was a play at the end of the 19th century, and then Griffith adapted it for silent film, and so it speaks to the sense during Reconstruction of both emancipation, but also I think suffrage, right, with the 15th Amendment giving Black men the right to vote. And so I think you see all of those kind of fears coming to the fore in the film, with really what happens when you give citizenship to Black people, and the kind of distress um, that it produces. So I think that's kind of, I guess, a general sense of what I think you get from the film. It runs over 3 hours long, so you're getting a lot of different narratives woven in. But I think a big one is the fact that Black men can vote, that Black people have to be incorporated now into the nation as citizens, and also the kind of economic concerns around both the loss of free Black labor, but also of Blacks to be able to now produce capital, participate in commerce. And so I think you see all of that there. And of course, then the way in which the nation is understood as like always reproducing whiteness, and white women then become very central to, to lynching, to these fear of what was called Negro domination, because they are the ones who produce the white nation or reproduce it.
Well, thank you for that. Pomon, so glad to see you, dear brother. And what I wanted to ask you was if you could tell us more about the creative approach and the backdrop to this film and the importance and the iconic standard it has and what made it so popular.
Sure. First of all, thank you for having me. It's always, my phone is always available to you.
Yes, sir.
So, and your father was incredibly meaningful to Chicago as well. So I had to say that before I move on. Let me just sort of put some things on the table. I used to teach acting a lot. And one of the terms that I used in dealing with acting was that acting is the art of making an audience believe that real things are happening to real people. So you create this environment in which the audience sits there and becomes absorbed to the point that they truly believe it for the time that they are exposed to it. So I just want to put that on the table. Secondly, when you look at that film, it's fundamentally a love story at its root. If you separate out the racial issues of it, it's fundamentally a love story. Not only is it a love story about an individual who happens to love a woman who he pursues after the war and comes back to, but it's also about a love of family that is separated by cause. Because you have the South, they're all related, they can interrelate with each other, but they have an ideological reason why they are not together. You wrap on top of that a cinematic gem for the time, because it was the first time in the nature of film that the continuous story, the long shots were used, the overlapping storylines, the integration of shots and stories. So it gave people, it wrapped them into a world that they truly believed in. And so you take that, you couple that with racism, and then you have people walking out of the theater realistically assuming that this is as real as it can get. One of the first scenes in the film, which I'm not sure how many people actually get, there's a scene where there's a wagon leaving town in the very beginning of the film. And what happens in that first scene is that a young Black child falls off the wagon. It is not, they don't make any point of it. The child falls off the wagon, somebody comes and picks it back up, and they continue in their story. So as we look at Birth of a Nation, I can only imagine what people from that time had to feel when they sat there in the dark and saw their world explode in a way that they had not seen it in the past. So I hope that answered your question, at least for the beginning. You're muted.
Absolutely. And Toby, if you could play that second clip, I think that would begin this conversation that we'll go to Caskey when we talk about these things that tie to the political entities of the movie. So Toby, if you could play that second clip.
Just one sec.
Thank you, Toby. So Kasky, we see this satire that becomes cinematic realism. And it shows how Blacks having the right to vote, will they eventually will have Black public officials. And this is what the outcome of this so-called ability to become part of the body politic. And there's a part of this when we look at that today that still kind of reverberates in many minds today, particularly when we saw the outward manifestation of what happened January 6th. So if you could give us your thoughts on that and how to tie that together.
Sure, would like to. Thank you very much, first of all, Dr. Dixon, for having me on this panel. I really appreciate it. I do Native American Indigenous cinema work, and I hadn't seen Birth of a Nation in, I don't know, since my intro to cinema class way back in the 90s, maybe. So it's been some time. I did rewatch it, but on double speed on YouTube. So it was only an hour and a half. And I teach a D.W. Griffith film called Battle at Elderbush Gulch in my film class. It occurred 2 years before this film, 1913, about American Indians. I can talk a little bit about the representation in there, but one of the things that really struck me as I watched this film is the echoes today and what we saw on January 6th in the Capitol. And when we get to the last card in the film, something about peace, maybe there won't be war in the future. I can't remember what it says. It reminded me a lot of Trump's speech during on the 6th when he said, "We love you, but please go home." I don't know if you guys remember that. He told the people that the terrorists that had taken over the Capitol that, "We love you, but go home." And I thought that the last kind of card in Birth of a Nation was much like that speech Trump made. And I think we'll get into propaganda, I'm sure, propaganda and ideology behind this film. The reverberations and echoes of the cancer of white supremacy in this film, promoted in 1915, and again in the 20s, when I think it was reissued in the early 20s again, is reminiscent of what we saw on January 6th to take over the Capitol. And one of the most kind of harrowing and upsetting pictures from the Capitol was the Confederate battle flag being waved in the US Capitol. And so in many ways, I feel in rewatching this film again, that we have not, we haven't lived down, we haven't taken apart, we haven't dismantled that which it was trying to build and in part helped build in the early turn of the century. So, yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Drake. When we begin to talk about that scene, perhaps one of the most famous scenes in the movie, and we talk about the injection of Blacks into the body politic, what does that scene represent? Because I saw a lot of stereotypic things about Blacks and the way that they were not wearing shoes. We saw them eating chicken and drinking, as this was part of what was to happen if Blacks were to become elected officials. So it kind of speaks to a lot of things, but particularly some of these stereotypes that continue to perpetuate our society today. So your thoughts?
Yes. So if people are watching, there are a variety of different things going on in that scene, and it as Professor Russell said, it's propaganda, right? It's reinforcing these sort of stereotypes and negative perceptions of Black people. Not just, really speaking more to like whether they're civilized, and then therefore whether they are actually worthy of citizenship, right? Of being incorporated into the nation. And the last, maybe it wasn't the last title card, but one of the title cards says the helpless white minority, right? And I think that definitely connects with what you're talking about with January 6th and the storming of the Capitol, right? This idea that white people are losing power, right? That they are losing power within representation, that they're losing power economically, socially, politically. And I think alongside that, though, at the same time period, well, close to the same time period, you'll get Alain Locke writing about a new Negro, right? And that's to counter, right, these sorts of images that you see in this film, but also to insist upon like Black people's abilities to be creative, to be able to kind of define what Blackness is, define who they are, and self-determination, which is very much not what you see in The Birth of a Nation.
So I would have all of our listeners and our participants to feel free to put your questions, comments, and concerns in the chat box, and we will get to them. Brother Pomone, I wanted to think about some of those things that we saw in that last clip, and thinking about the long-term effect some of these views and how cinematic realism has turned these views into now generational rituals, those things that people really believe that they have part and parcel in passing on to future generations as a way to create this hierarchy of humanity where, for the most part, Blacks sit at the very base. So your thoughts on that?
Well, the first thing that I would say is that this movie was not made for Black people. And if you sort of think about that, then you think about the fact that white people created this so that they could redefine the belief systems of their people, so that they could shift them in a way that they could get them to move forward with the continued exploitation of Black people. But when I looked at that scene, I found some interesting things about it. Okay, number one, about the shoes. So why was this thing with the shoes even an issue? When during slavery, um, shoes were purposely either not given to Black folks, or they were made in a way that they could fit on either foot so that they could dress in the dark. So that became an issue that I'm not really quite sure what they were trying to say to white people to get them riled up. The second was, and I think more importantly, was the need to not to submit to Black people in any way. And we find that even today, that part of what happens, especially when you talk about, white people, when you see them in stores and what is happening with all of the pushback today, is that some of it has to do with their forward momentum being stopped. If you are stopping their momentum, then you have an issue. So we can see all kinds of signs, like during in the South, where Black people, if you were driving, you couldn't pass white people driving in the car. No matter how fast or how slow they were going, you had to stay behind them and not pass them. So there are all types of representations of that. The other thing that they were really pushing in this is the whole notion of interracial marriage and the need to keep that from happening. And so how do you do that? So how do you build a belief system in people? How do you do it in general? Well, educators have to take some responsibility for that, at least they should, within the context of education. Why are we educating people if we're not trying to build a kind of society that will sustain the world and put it in a better place? But what happens in film and what happens in theater and even in television is that we create these dynamics that become the essence of what we feel about ourselves. So you have people, for example, that will say, I'm doing me. Well, what does that mean? What it truly means is that you have been consumed by media to assume that the way that you operate, what you wear, how you talk, how you speak, how you move is in some way in your control. What is actually has been pushed in a way that it has burned into our brains, into what we believe and what we think. And so I think the Birth of a Nation during that period, not only did it impact the white community's ability to reinvigorate the Klan, but if you look at a few years later with the development of the Garvey movement, the anti-slavery movement, Carter G. Woodson and Black History Month saying that we've got to have a way in which we can tell the true stories of ourselves, we begin to move in a fashion that will give us some individual control over what we are. So that's what I have to say.
Thank you, sir. Toby, if you're there, can you play that third clip? So we begin to look at that particular piece. And as Dr. Drake said earlier, this movie was once a play called The Three Klansmen. And when we think about the rise of the Klan in 1866 in Pulaski, Tennessee, as a response to emancipation, Mr. Lester, Mr. Crow, Mr. Jones, Mr. Kennedy, Mr. Reed, and Mr. McCord, the original 6 founding members of the Ku means small, Klux means circle, Klan means family, was this piece that was a response. So by 1915, we see this movie does what? It gives rise to the second wave of the Ku Klux Klan. Kasky, if you could go into that, that would be great.
Yeah, it was a novel as well, if I remember correctly, a trilogy by Thomas Dixon. Yeah,
Thomas Frederick Dixon. Isn't that way too close, good people? But you can't make that up. That's why my daddy said Frederick Douglass. Much different, but
Yeah.
it's way too close.
So, and I've again, I do indigenous cinema, but this film in particular is kind of credited, if you want to call it, with the rebirth of the Klan, and the population of the Klan soars in the 20s. And like I said, it gets reissued in the 20s. And in kind of a related vein, as I was watching this, if we're talking about propaganda and ideology, as I was watching this, I couldn't help but think of the case of a propagandist named Julius Streicher, who was wrote for Der Stürmer. He pre-World War II into World War II, and he was convicted of inciting genocide by the military tribunal at Nuremberg and hanged for writing articles showing Jews in a similar light to how Griffith has shown Blacks, preying on Jewish men, preying on Gentile women, German women. I wonder that, and the tribunal had American judges and American lawyers, that they're overseas hanging a white supremacist propagandist, yet at home here in America, a white supremacist propagandist makes this major film and is lauded for it. Of course, the NAACP, there were a lot of protests at the time. The NAACP tried to prevent this film from being shown, but the film is considered the kind of birth of modern cinema for some of the reasons that people mention in terms of the format and the structure. And yet overseas, American lawyers and judges are hanging a propagandist. I just think about why that difference. And then I saw a question in the comment board: should we show this film in film class? I'm sure a lot of you saw it like I did in my intro to cinema. And of course, the professor discussed the issues of race in it, but considered it a kind of the first modern film. And I've wrestled with that. I wrestled with showing Griffith's work in my American Indian film class, but I show it and we talk about it. Anyway, it's just, I'm kind of free-forming here. So, and I kind of forget your initial question, Dr. Dixon, but yeah.
We were talking about how it connected to the second rise of the Klan. So Pomone, Dr. Drake, either one of you all, because we have a lot of questions that we want to get to. We have a very intrigued and interested student body here, and they are giving up some great questions that I'm sure will be interesting.
You know, loss is an interesting thing. When people put themselves in a position to assume that they have ownership over something and they have the capacity to lose it, they can freak out in a number of ways. Frederick, you mentioned earlier the economic engine related specifically to, I think, Wall Street when you mentioned it. And so this film, to me, not only did it represent the need for people to keep Black folks from being fully, I hate using the term, but fully integrated into this society, and used it as a methodology for putting a wedge further between people. And also, created an art form that was replicated not only in film, but in vaudeville. We continue to do that, to Amos and Andy when it was on, and the caricatures superseded the positive images of people that were even in that. And so when you talk about that, and you talk about Black Wall Street and the destruction of an economic system that was built when Black folks shouldn't have even had any money to build anything with, they were able to pull together and to create the society that was ultimately destroyed. And part of our challenge in America has been that it's done continuously over and over again. So for those of your students that don't know, the lottery started out as the policy game. It was a black game. It was made illegal. It was taken over by first the syndicate, then the government, and changed into the lottery. It was an economic engine for Black people and helped to build printing companies, churches, chickens. It funded Negro League Baseball, the development of the first Black hospital in Providence Hospital. All of that came from policy money. Then you snatch that as an economic engine out of the Black community, leaving it with nothing again. Stepping further, if we look at today, marijuana, weed, the same thing. It was an economic engine for Black folks. It has now been made legal and we can't even get a piece of it. So all of this ties to the inability of this country to not only face its history, but also to understand that we as humans on this planet need to share it in a way that is beneficial to all. I'm going to make this final comment on that, and some people might find it interesting. The richest man in history on the planet is Mansa Musa, who was African, worth, I think, 40 billion or 4 billion, something like that. That's criminal too, because no one person should own anything to that degree when the majority of people are suffering. So until we take education and change the minds of our people to say that what is the most important thing for you as you move through life is to find a way to secure this earth and to improve the quality of life for everybody, then we missed the point.
Well said. Dr. Drake?
I'm not sure what the question is, but
it was tied to the scene with the KKK and the rise of the second wave of the KKK.
Okay. Well, I wanted to just comment on the question that was also commented on about the about teaching the film. Right? Showing it. I don't teach intro. I don't teach intro to film, but I do when I teach Black visual culture and popular media courses, I will sometimes show at least some of the clips.
Toby,
and
jump on that, Toby.
Yeah. I will show some of the clips, and because I think it's the same as, well, if you're teaching post-colonial literature, do you not teach Joseph Conrad? I mean, you have Black writers, Black filmmakers. I mean, they do write back too, right? Or signify on some of these kind of negative representations. So I think that in order to, be able to properly critique that, and in order to think about what people are doing in response to it, you have to have the actual source. I do think it matters, though, how you're teaching it, right? And oftentimes, who's teaching it? I mean, I've seen so many times where Toni Morrison, where I've heard things that I'm like, that's not at all what that book was about. So what you like, who teaches it and how can matter as well.
Can I speak that real quick? Because
Absolutely, go ahead.
Drake, I completely agree. The how is so important in the teaching. And one thing when I teach Griffith's film, and I'm about to do it Wednesday night, and it's much like Birth of a Nation, it's only about 30 minutes. But the kind of the layout is Native Americans are attacking same actor. I think it's Lillian Gish, white woman, and threatening to rape her. They're going to eat her puppies, and one of them gets killed. And so they attack a little settler's cabin, much like the little cabin that was attacked in Birth of a Nation. And when the threat of the natives to break into the cabin and get to these white women becomes great, a gun is put down over the top of the head of the white woman, just like in Birth of a Nation. You saw the guns in that film, Birth of a Nation. They're going to kind of beat these white women to death instead of allowing the black soldiers to get to them. So that fear of miscegenation is the same. And the film for my students is just kind of silly. They couldn't believe that some of these stereotypes and this film exists. But then it's important to ask them to put that critical lens again to the films that are coming out today or in the last 30 or 40 years. So sure, it's easy to see the propaganda behind Birth of a Nation now that we watch it 100 years. But can we do that? Can we see maybe a more subtle propaganda in more recent films? And I try to encourage my students to do that. Just kind of, anyways, what Dr. Drake was saying, the how seems to be the important part of teaching the text, any text.
You know, when I looked at the film, again, the thing that kept popping into my head is that why is there not a contemporary film that has had that level of impact? And how do you, and as a filmmaker, how do you get to the point where you are creating things that are of value to change the minds of and behavior of people? And this movie had a level of impact that I'm just wondering how and why other films have not come out that have that same impact in different arenas. Because I can't come up with a Black film that has had that kind of power. Now, I know that there are some that have had influence, but I'm not sure that that level of power has been represented in other forms.
And even in a financial sense, my understanding that was Birth of a Nation represents the most profitable film up until the next movie was what was it, Brother Pomone?
Well, I'm not sure which one you're thinking about. I thought it was the one that Howard Hughes did way
No,
back.
it's a Christmas movie. It's
It's a Wonderful Life.
It's a wonderful life.
Because it's played forever. You know,
and we're talking about this leads going into the financial piece. So there is another layered nuance that folks were willing to pay money and valuable time to make sure this was restructured, and other than destructed, it was the piece that all could agree on in many ways that would lead generations. So it has this iconic standing in many ways. So
but what that means is that the entire media got behind it. And so not only was it the making of the film, but it was the newspapers, it was the way people talked about it. You know, you can, when you create a film, the first week is indication of the success of marketing. After the first weekend, but after that, it is a issue of public discussion, of word of mouth, of someone calling their friends and saying, you've got to see this project. So it takes on a life of its own. In this case, the conscience of America took this film and pushed it into the world. And I would assume that they taught it on every level. They showed it in every school, in every church, you know, every place that they could, because they believed it. And they believed the essence of what it was. We call it propaganda as Black people, but I'm not convinced that anybody during that period of time that was not Black would have felt that way. They thought it was truth and pushed it as such.
Cinematic power. So we got a question here, you all. Do you believe that the Black Congress scene helped Woodrow Wilson's segregation of the federal government stay longer due to the film's success? Anybody who'd like to answer that?
Yes. And not only did it affect that, but it affected everything else politically that happened within the next century. I mean, it impacted the way that Black people began to build organizations. It impacted the way we felt about ourselves, the way that we are looked at. Um, when you go around the world and people have perceptions of us, it all comes from media, because they don't see us. Um, I was in Trinidad, and I was up in the rainforest, and I saw a young lady walking down the street, and she was sagging, and she had a one of the t-shirts on. She looked just like somebody from Chicago. And I said, look at this. That is that is American culture that is that has influenced people that are up in the rainforest, away from everybody. But that's what we face when we have a vehicle in our hands that has this level of impact, and it changes people's lives.
I would also say to agree with Pomone and say that it influenced segregation on not just in the government but on all levels. I'm sure voting and schools. Yeah, I would. The like Pomone said, this film would be reality, became reality, and became way people imaged the South and Black people and white Southerners the way when they drew up a mental picture of what it was. Um, I'm sure that part of this film created that mental picture for a lot of white Americans. So I would expand that from the segregation of the federal government to segregation at large. That question.
Absolutely. We got another question. How would you compare the depiction of the antebellum South in Birth of a Nation to other mainstream works such as Huckleberry Finn?
I'm trying to get some back.
Okay.
Okay.
I mean, the one that
Feel
would
free.
come to
Feel
mind
free,
is Gone
Pomone.
with the Wind, right? That would come to mind. But
And
yeah,
that was the movie I was
Yeah,
thinking of,
Gone with
Cassie. Gone with the Wind.
I see them as both kind of doing the same sort of work. Huck Finn, I don't know. That's more of an interesting question for me.
It depends on which version of it you're referring to. I think all of it relates to America's inability to recognize the historical value that Black people have brought to the world. And there's certain things that you cannot justify unless you denigrate everybody else. I mean, is it possible for you to do the things that were done to the Africans, to the Native Americans, without vilifying them? Is it possible for you to accept your behavior or the behavior that you've done without in some way truly pushing the fact that you believe that it is the fact? And so I think that a lot of those films were part of the need for people. Let me go back on them, because it was what they truly had been educated to believe. And so as a result of that, it is what spewed out of their creativity. It was the same notions, the same belief system that Black people were unintelligent. That, like for example, we still today talk about how um, Africans dealt with. We were storytellers. That a lot was passed from word to mouth, and we continue to ignore the number of books that were written, that were in Timbuktu, that were in other places on the continent. We don't even acknowledge the fact that we had a written language as well. So
I just want to add that, I mean, there's a reason why you have Marcus Garvey, W.E.B. Du Bois, both writing about propaganda in this general time frame. And so I think it's really important to think about that in relationship to kind of the circulation of these images, whether still images, visual images. I mean, there were lots of caricatures that also were produced during this time to sort of present Black people as, uncivilized, unintelligent. And so for Garvey, for Du Bois to really hammer, repeatedly that propaganda matters, and the way in which, Black people responded with their own. There's a reason for that. And, I think media changes over time. It always is still, it's always there. It has that influence. But I think in this particular time period, the different forms people were very engaged with. And so it worked in a very strategic and deliberate way as a platform to marginalize and disenfranchise Black people.
Yes.
Garvey knew more than I think anybody that our problem was a global problem, and that to be able to pull us out of the mire that we were stuck in, we needed to be re-educated about what we were and how we felt about ourselves. And so a lot of what he did in terms of the educational process, the things that he wrote, how they looked, how they marched, the kind of businesses that he created, was to give Black people an opportunity to see themselves in a different way. What I remind students a lot of, or people that I'm talking to, is that it wasn't until my generation that Black men or Black people could even look white people in the eye. Something as simple as that. Something as simple as in St. Louis, they had laughing barrels that when Black people walked down the street, they had to stick their head in a barrel so that white people wouldn't think that they were laughing at them. There were times when we couldn't eat vanilla ice cream except on the 4th of July. That is the reality of what media did in terms of influencing our ability to find ourselves. So it wasn't until after Malcolm died that the Black Arts Movement started, and we began to frame things that created a base for us to reclaim our power.
Okay. We got another question. Is there any other example where a film actually created or revived a major social group or movement?
Can you read that one more time?
Absolutely. Is there any other example where a film actually created or revived a major social group or movement?
I think, and this maybe might respond to one of the questions Mr. Rami asked about if there's been any film that's quite had this sort of influence or power. Melvin Van Peebles, Sweet Sweetback, 1971, Sweet Sweetback's Badass Song. It's not that, the Black power movement certainly hadn't dwindled at that point. It was, I think, still in its heyday, but it made both a significant had a significant influence on the social and political scene, right, as well as the Hollywood movie filmmaking industry. And I mean, largely it's because the Black Panther Party supported the film. And then, you end up into what's often called Blaxploitation, and literally the way in which it saved Hollywood at that particular time. So that would be one that I can think of. It's tied to a movement, to a social movement, and that had influence in various different spaces within society.
If I followed that track, first of all, I agree with you on Sweetback. It was the first anti-hero. It was the first time that a Black man on that level was able to fight the police. But I would step one back before that, and that would be the one that Sidney Poitier did.
Look Who's Coming to Dinner?
Guess Who's Coming to Dinner?
No, the one where he slapped the head of the Klan. First time that a Black person slapped a white person on film.
In the Heat of the Night?
Heat of the Night, thank you. In the Heat of the Night, yeah. But I would also mention The Spook Who Sat by the Door, which created a whole feeling, more so among people in the business industry. I was with one of the top brain surgeons in the world, brother. And we were at lunch, And he asked me, had I seen Spook Who Sat by the Door? And I told him about my relationship with the film. But anyway, he said, the Spook Who Sat by the Door gave him the ability to be able to navigate in that world, to be able to sit in there, to take the stuff and then to go back to the community and build the way that he ought to be able to do that. Same thing that they did with the Spook. My final film, and this was a little strange, is Black Panther, but for different reasons than most. First of all, I think that anytime you look at Afrocentric films of the future, you have to be able to do it without the context of capitalism, and you have to be able to see the world in a different way. And I don't think the Black Panther achieved that, but it did two fundamental things. It opened the door for more Black actors to do and work in African projects, which had not been done because most people have been turning them away. That's one thing. And then secondly, I normally get my shirts made at an African shop here in Chicago. I've got a designer that does my clothes for me. That is not to say anything other than the fact that I couldn't get anything made after Black Panther came out because there were so many people in these stores buying African clothing and reverting back to what that meant. When you look at Netflix now and the number of African films that are on Netflix, that's a direct correlation to the impact that Black Panther had. And it opened up that whole world to allow the African cinema to get back to us.
Thank you.
I would add one thing for that question about is there any social movement or cultural group, maybe not as powerful as Birth of a Nation or been around so long, but in indigenous cinema, Dance with Wolves, and a handful of movies, and maybe because the indigenous population in America is about just 1% of the population, small population, but it seemed to have a worldwide impact. Dance with Wolves, but also the few of the revisionist Westerns like Little Big Man, Cheyenne Autumn, A Man Called Horse was a horrible different one, but I don't know if they revived a culture, but I would say it might have changed the way Native Americans were viewed vis-a-vis the previous Westerns, the John Wayne Westerns. And I often discuss in the film class how these, like A Dance with Wolves is not necessarily a huge step forward in Native cinema, if you know what I mean. But
and I think, but part of that is that if the media, going back to media again, if they ignore the films, then you never really get to understand the impact that they've had.
Yeah.
And so a lot of times you've got these great cinematic pieces. Daughters of the Dusk is an interesting piece. But if the media steps outside and says, we're going to completely ignore this art form, the quality of these films don't mean anything because we're not going to put any investment into promoting them, then that's where we end up having the problem. The only reason Black Panther made it to the extent that it did is because of the millions of dollars that were invested in marketing that film. You couldn't turn around without seeing that it was coming out and where it was going, but that's because it was a Marvel project.
Mm-hmm.
I think one of the movies that readily comes to mind is Schindler's List.
Mm-hmm.
And in that, we know that there's a small group of people who would have pushed that movie as important, who would have backed that movie as important. But I think as far as reviving a thought, Schindler's List deserves to be mentioned because of what it did during that time. And now, still to this day, the way that it's shown in many other arenas like higher education, even K through 12, it's looked to as the movie that allows to have this conversation. I think that's very interesting as well.
It is, and part of that is because they invested a hell of a lot of money in developing that curriculum, making sure that it was in all the schools, making sure that all the schools, that a number of the schools had free tickets, that they could bust them into the theaters. And it was pushed on that level. So it became part of the educational process. And still today, it's taught in a lot of schools.
Absolutely. Well, any parting thoughts as we wrap up? And I have to say, this has been very interesting. more than I could have imagined. But to begin our Black History Month celebration this way, I think it was very needed, and having such an august body leaves it in a scholarly manner. So parting shots, if you will. How about you, Dr. Drake?
Oh, I just want to say thank you for having me, and I'm really happy to see that
You know, I've been
the center
looking forward
is.
to working with you for quite some time. You've been quite a help to the Black Study Center. I must tell everyone from the very beginning, Dr. Drake has been very helpful.
Well, I'm really excited about the things that you are doing there. So
Thank you. Kasky?
It seems like we're just getting started. Let's go on for another few hours here, you guys. Everybody stay here.
Can you imagine that?
This has been, fantastic. I really, really appreciate being a part of this panel as kind of the person who does a different area of research, but related. I really appreciate it. Love the conversation, and seriously could stay another couple hours if need be. Maybe.
Well, Kasky, you know I appreciate you as a colleague and much more. So
And
thank you.
Same here. Thank you very much, Dr. Dix. Appreciate it.
So first of all, thank you for inviting me, and
Thank
to the
you for
students
accepting. Thank you, brother.
for the students that are here. It only takes one. It takes one person to make a difference. It takes one person to make a change. But that change has to be constructed on a broad base. So each of you, whatever career you have decided to go into, if you can look at the world as a change agent, if you can look at the world and say to it that I'm going to tell my friends that racism is something that needs to be eradicated. I'm going to tell my friends, the folks that are close to me, my family, that we have to save this world, that I have to create a curriculum, and I have to teach students, that I have to commit to developing young people behind me so that the world is in a better place than when we found it. It is our moral obligation,
Yes, sir,
to make sure that we don't make the mistakes of our foreparents, the elders that came before us, that we put ourselves in a position to create the kind of change that will make a difference to this world. Thank you for having me.
you're welcome.
Call me anytime.
Before you guys go, I want to show you something that's very precious to me, so everybody get ready. Hey, everybody, put your hands in there. This is African American history, the intro class, and what we have here is future scholars who are in the mix of creating this research that will indeed become part and extend the mainstream narrative. So again, I thank you all so much. You know how much it means to us. And for everybody else, please keep up with our events. They will begin to start rolling, but we will keep you in the loop. And to my panel, my august panel, I could never thank you enough.
Thanks for having me.
Peace and many blessings, good people. Please feel free to let me know how I can return the favor.
All righty.
all right.
Thank you.